session of the Gerhard Center webinar series, The Aftermath of COVID-19, the New Social Impact Ecosystem. We launched the series back in April with the aim of discussing concepts that are currently not mainstream and may or perhaps should become mainstream in the aftermath of COVID-19. Today is the 18th session, and it is a pleasure to have with us Claire Woodcraft. Claire is the Executive Director of a recently launched Center for Strategic Philanthropy at the Dodge Business School, Cambridge University. The title of her talk is going to be Actionable Knowledge to Catalyze Greater Philanthropic Impact from the World's Fastest Growing Regions and the Role of Research Centers. Claire has over 25 years of experience working in the field of socio-economic development and philanthropy in emerging markets. Before her current appointment with the TBS with Cambridge, she's a former CEO of Emirates Foundation, the National Foundation of the United Arab Emirates, where she has led the organization transition from a traditional grant making to the model of venture philanthropy. During her time as CEO, she was elected as the chairman of the Arab Foundation Forum. Earlier, she was a deputy director of the Shell Foundation, a leader in philanthropic sector, whose business model entails building scalable social enterprises to address global development challenges, otherwise known as enterprise-based philanthropy. Prior to this, she was the regional director of communication for the Royal Dutch Shell in the Middle East and North Africa. He also headed Visa International Public Affairs arm in emerging markets. He was also a finance editor of Middle East Economic Survey, specialized energy journal, reporting on socio-economic development related to oil economies. He writes extensively on the paradigm shift in the philanthropic sector and is a vocal champion of venture philanthropy. She's a fluent speaker of Arabic, French, and she has a BA in modern languages and MS in development from LSE. Now, just to comment, I mean, Claire, we actually have at Gerhard Center, we have a case study about Emirates Foundation. It actually it talks about the transformation led by Claire. Claire also is authoring a chapter in a book that we are currently publishing. Her chapter is going to be published as a Gerhard Center report very soon. And the topic is about venture philanthropy. That could actually be very interesting background material. And we'll share it with the speaker, with the participant. Now, the plan of the webinar, as usual, Claire will talk for 25 minutes or so. And then we'll have a Q&A rounds of questions. So if you have any question, please type it through your chat box. And then in the end, we'll wrap. Without much ado, Claire, thank you for being with us. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you very much to you, the team, and the Gerhard Center. Pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's always nice to come back home. So I'm no longer in the Middle East, but I always feel that the Middle East is my first, second, if not first home, actually. وزمان ما حكيت بالعربي فهي فرصة, but we're not going to do that today because this webinar is in English. But lovely to see old friends from the region with us today. I really would love for this to be super interactive, so I'm not going to talk for probably more than 20 minutes. I'd like to share with you my thoughts about the run-up to the launch of the center and my broader thoughts about the paradigm shift in philanthropy. And of course, I do have a specific connection to Middle East philanthropy, but our center will be focused on a broader emerging market pool. So I'm going to pull up a deck, having been guided by Ali on how to share a screen. And hopefully this is going to work beautifully. But I don't want people to think that this is just a conversation about what the center is going to be doing. What I'd like to hear from people is what you think we should be doing. I believe that all such initiatives should be market-based and that we should be constantly reviewing our purpose and our mission. So whilst I'm going to share with you, if you like, the straw man of our strategy, because we've just launched, obviously, this week, but I think our sincere goal over time is to ensure that we are constantly listening to our stakeholders. So just to give you a quick overview, the center is, as Ali said, inside the Judge Business School. I think that's for a very purposeful reason, that we believe that there is a lot for philanthropists to learn from business schools and vice versa. I personally believe that enterprise-based philanthropy, Ali referenced it earlier, and it's something we championed when I was at Shell Foundation, is really the philosophy about understanding more about how commercial organizations create commercial value and applying some of those principles to the creation of social value. For me, that is the essence of philanthropy. How do we create sustainable, scalable, measurable social value? And the way we do that, in my own humble experience of running foundations, is by, in many cases, adopting the principles that are used in the private sector. And if you look at business schools, they are essentially studying organizational effectiveness. And I think that's a huge opportunity for us in the philanthropic sector. So for those of you who wanted to know more about where we sit. So we sit inside, of course, the bigger, huge institution that is the University of Cambridge, which has been around for hundreds of years. And that in and of itself, of course, is also an amazing opportunity because we can pull from various academic disciplines and the wealth that is Cambridge University's resources. So let me just click through to the next slide, which it's not letting me do, which I'm not quite sure why that is the case. Okay, let me see if I can do this differently. Okay, there we go. It's just a bit slow. So what are we looking at the center? First of all, I should say we're focused on emerging markets. There was a lot of work done in the run up to the creation of the center to ensure that we weren't reinventing the wheel. And what we discovered is that while there are lots of centers looking at philanthropy, there weren't really any that specifically dedicated to emerging markets. We in particular, we're looking at emerging markets, but in particular, we're looking at the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, because that's where we found we had the least amount of resources, essentially, and where we felt there was the biggest need. But we will, of course, be also looking more broadly at what's happening. What I think personally is interesting about this opportunity is that we know historically much of developmental policy of the international development community was either not particularly exploring philanthropy as a partner, but also a lot of the discourse was coming from the global north. This is an opportunity for us to create a new discourse between development, the international development community, and the global south, and particularly obviously under the framework of the SDGs. We know that there is a huge growth in philanthropic capital coming from these emerging markets, with the maturation of capital markets, with the maturation of family offices, families, successful businesses in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, wanting to really have a more institutional approach to how they do philanthropy and having the capital to do that. So our purpose was to really try and support the growth of that capital into this space, into the philanthropic space, but also to ensure that we collectively are able to maximize its impact. And that is the opportunity for us using our 3 strands. So we're going to be doing research, executive education, and convening. And the purpose of that mission is really to ensure that, first of all, that we understand what's happening in these markets and what in philanthropy works and what doesn't, and that we can then create a research portfolio that can feed our executive education program, which will be out there for philanthropists, practitioners, even non-practitioners, advisors, people looking to understand the sector better. And finally, we hope to be able to convene conversations in this space. So as it says here on the slide, the mission really unleash that potential that's coming from this growth and become a leading center of actionable knowledge around philanthropy in emerging markets. So we again built our strategy, built our raison d'etre, if you like, around these areas. So we know that future economic growth, even with COVID, is likely to continue to be coming from emerging markets, from growth markets. This, we surmise, will create an economic power shift from that to the south and further east. This will create more opportunities in terms of philanthropic capital coming to market. And we know that already we're talking about $1 trillion market, that with the growth of high net worth wanting to create philanthropic entities and intergenerational wealth transfer, we're talking about trillions of dollars coming into these markets. And we also know that that is a possibility to fund the SDG funding gap. So we know there's a 2.5 trillion funding gap with the SDGs. We know that governments are increasingly looking for other sources of capital in the developing world. And we believe that philanthropy has a huge role to play in this space, but we need to get better at understanding what is the current situation, where is philanthropic capital going, what is it funding, what is it supporting, and how can we better mobilize capital for SDGs and better collaborate in this space. So our theory of change was that despite decades, if not centuries, of well-intentioned giving into philanthropy, we still see certain inefficiencies in our sector. I've seen them myself working with foundations, running foundations, that no matter how hard we try, creating social value that is sustainable and scalable and measurable is not easy. It's not an easy space to operate. It's not easy to quantify it. It's not easy to understand, are you really able to create long-term solutions to entrenched socioeconomic problems? And part of the reason why it's not easy is that we simply don't have a huge amount of data in that space. And often we are working either in isolation or we're working in a void. We simply don't understand enough about the problems we're trying to solve and about which interventions have historically worked and which haven't, which then leads us to inefficiencies. I myself have seen that with the foundations where I've worked, that often you end up with overly high transaction costs. Often you discover that the problem you thought you were trying to solve is actually not exactly what you surmised it to be because you didn't have enough initial research and data to fully understand it. And often you find that problems can never really be solved unless you're working with the entire ecosystem. So where you might have started with a specific program, you then grow to understand you need to work with governments, you need to work with the private sector, you need to work with fellow philanthropists in the third sector. So we want to really make sure that all of those challenges are understood and addressed, that we can have an evidence-based approach to developing academic applied research and filling some of these data gaps, that we can then also transfer that into a tailored executive education program that is out there for practitioners in those markets, specifically Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia, and that we can use both the content of our research agenda and our learnings from the executive education program and our networks to have a broader convening power and a bigger discussion about the role of philanthropic capital in these markets towards the SDGs. We hope that our impact will ultimately be to improve the efficiency of philanthropic capital investments, to improve the competences and leaderships capabilities within our sector, and of course, ultimately to maximize impact. At the end of the day, it's all about impact. And I personally believe, and we hear this repeated ad nauseum, but I really think it's super important that collaboration is critical. We cannot create socioeconomic value that is sustainable and scalable alone. So you see who we plan to work with there. It's a broad church, but I think it's everybody who's interested in this growth in philanthropic capital and in creating real system change. So at Judge Business School, we will be looking at the range of new instruments coming to market. We recently heard of the Ford Foundation putting together a $1 billion bond, looking at protecting the capital of the endowment and being more innovative in the way it deploys funding. We will be looking at collaboration beyond just traditional philanthropic actors. Even inside the Judge Business School, we have centers, for example, the Center for Financial Innovation and Social Innovation, who will be supporting our work. We hope to bring really local solutions. So we're really doing a lot of outreach into our emerging markets to make sure that we are listening to what's happening in those markets and that we're building solutions that are tailored for those markets. We will be looking to try and leverage the wealth of intellectual knowledge and capability inside the university to start to identify systemic solutions. Again, an area that we've all been talking about for some time now, that we can find really sustainable and permanent solutions to some of our entrenched socioeconomic challenges, be that job creation in the Middle East, be it supporting access to education and healthcare in Africa, be it supporting technological innovation in Asia. But it's really about trying to find systemic solutions. And we are still exploring our place on the continuum. Many of you will be familiar with this conversation. Indeed, the chapter of for the book that the Gerhard Center is producing that I wrote was exactly exploring this for the Middle East. So how do we maximize the ecosystem's collective input into philanthropy? We know that we have an increasingly diverse range of actors interested in this space. We have our traditional foundations, but we also have this merge into now social enterprises, into impact investing, into what Ali and I were just talking about before we started the call, into businesses getting much more explicit about how they declare and define their social purpose. So I think people have asked us where we sit on this continuum, and I think it's essentially it's a journey for us to figure out where we can be most value adding, and one that will be continuous as this continuum itself continues to evolve very rapidly, as I say, with the recent announcement of particularly foundations looking at very different financial instruments and going above and beyond traditional grant making. Sector trends that we are currently seeing, that we are seeing even with our COVID research. So we have just started a piece of research, an industry report on COVID-19, because we felt we wanted to understand the immediate impact. That is not a longer term piece of academic research, but that will be a quick snapshot into some of the sectoral shifts that we're seeing. But I think from our initial interviews, we are already discovering that many of those shifts align with what we were already seeing. So obviously the convergence with impact investing, which I've just talked about, really that continuum where we now have traditional philanthropists talking to purely commercial organizations or intermediary advisors. The strong vociferal call for more collaboration, we've seen that arise over the past few years with organizations like Co-Impact, an offshoot of the Giving Pledge, calling for philanthropists to pool capital to deal with some of these wicked problems, and the revisiting of the regulation of the sector. This, from my own experience, I know in the Middle East is really a hot topic. How do we work with governments, help governments to understand the importance of philanthropic capital, and how do we make sure that the regulatory environment is conducive for growth of this capital and greater efficiency? So I think those three trends were ones that we had identified historically, but even with our COVID research, I think they are not becoming obsolete, quite the opposite. They're actually becoming even more relevant, and they resonate even more. And then finally, we have a straw man research agenda, if you like, where we have identified areas where we think there is a gap in the market for philanthropic research, and where we also think that the Judge Business School has a huge opportunity and competitive advantage to be able to provide insights into these areas. These are areas that have arisen from our own initial research into where we think the gaps are, but also looking at what are the huge strengths of being inside the business school. So again, I've just touched on that, but our own experience around, my own experience notably around governance, regulation and risk is something that I think is important recently with some of our research teams around how we can do a piece of research in that space to ensure that this growth of philanthropic capital is not stymied by a regulation that is not conducive. And we can talk more about that, but we've seen some specific cases in the region. We've talked about scaling impact ad nauseum as practitioners for decades. Clearly, that is our very raison d'etre. And yet, do we really have scientific, robust, rigorous research to inform us as to what is the best way to scale impact? I'm not sure. I have my own personal opinion, and I know many of my peers do, and I'm sure many people on this call do, but we would like to see a more institutionalized approach to defining best practice. We are looking at a brand equity, which might seem initially like a strange topic for philanthropy, but again, we are seeing more and more foundations needing to improve their communications, needing to strengthen their brands, needing to improve their marketing and outreach, quite simply because that helps convene, it helps build stronger partnerships, and it helps raise more funds, more capital. So there will be some of our work looking at that area. Effective partnerships, again, is something we have talked at in sort of random fashion over the years. We know increasingly as we look at the SDGs that there is a real drive to build partnerships for creating socioeconomic value, particularly in developing markets. But we also know that partnerships are complicated, and we are keen to develop some best practice around how to render them most effective. I mentioned impact bonds, and we've seen several over the years, and that's one particular area. When you ask people what's the biggest challenge about creating an impact bond, it's often not the complexity of the legalese or the financial structuring, it's actually building the initial partnerships. Effective teams is one close to my own heart. I firmly believe that we often have very smart, young, driven talent that is keen to get involved in this space, and yet we are still not clear on what are the competences and the skills that we need to deliver maximum impact using philanthropic capital. I think there is a lot of similarities with how we look at developing talent within a business school, and I think that's a real opportunity for us to develop an executive education program that responds to these specific talent development needs of practitioners in these markets. And finally, innovative finance, of course, how can we ignore that? We are seeing a huge amount of creativity as new financial instruments come to market. Gone are the days where our good old grant is the only option. I still firmly believe that grants are absolutely critical to buy down risk and to bring in other practitioners and other funders, rather, to leverage additional capital in the sector. But we're now looking at a whole range of sophisticated instruments, from loan guarantees to equity instruments, and of course to bonds and the like. So I think this is our starting point for our research agenda. We want to hear from people like our audience here today, work with organizations like the Gerhard Center to ensure that as we build and invest in this space, we are ensuring that we will have research outcomes that can be applicable and really help us drive greater efficiency in the sector. So let me stop there, and hopefully I will manage to stop sharing the screen and pave the way for discussions and questions.
Okay. Thank you, Claire. I'm going to just give Kariman and her team a chance. I have a few pointers that I just want to sort of bring it up. The first one you've talked about is the issue of language. The issue of language. I mean, business people do not talk the language of philanthropy. And I could give you a very simple example. King Khalid Foundation, for example, they used to actually be an operating foundation. You find this very much in developing countries, where a foundation do work by itself. Now, this is interesting. This is a case, when you look at it from a business perspective, we call this a market failure. When you try to outsource and there is no good suppliers to provide the service, you have two choices. Either you do it yourself, which is the easy route, or the other one, you develop the ecosystem, which is the hardest route, but in the long term. Now, this is in business, it's very common. I mean, we talk about business strategy, about how do you outsource. Now, when you talk this to people in philanthropy, they just don't understand it. Now, I'll give you another interesting example. In October last year, the Gerhard Center, we had a BOP conference, and we brought people from the typical BOP people with the philanthropy people. Now, they're talking about, they complement each other's. And it was interesting when they started talking to each other's that, yes, they use different languages, but you can see that they complement each other. Now, I'm not going to add people talking about business and human rights, because they talk in another parallel. What I'm trying to say, the language, the narrative, and maybe that's because we tend to work in different spheres. And you have to bring them up all together to work in a more concerted effort. And that might sort of, I don't want to say unify the narrative, but at least we understand each other's. So this is the one comment. The other comment is about,
let me start there, Ali, because you just asked. That's a big, complex subject. So to be, as a linguist, I think language is very important, and I'm very passionate about language. But I think it's something we touched on in recent conversations around the lexicon of the sector, and it's something that we have all come across in the years in the sector, right? So I'm always conscious when I go out to the market and I say to people, when I was working at Shell Foundation, we're angel investing in social enterprises in order to create scalable, sustainable, measurable value. You lose people immediately. It is a complex sector, and we also talk about initiatives or concepts that are not common. We have an extremely heterogeneous sector. As one of my colleagues said, you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. Foundations are extremely different from even within one country, even within one market, which means that the tools of language, we really don't have them to be able to have a conversation. If you've ever had a debate about social enterprise or a workshop on social enterprise or a conference on social enterprise, you spend the first half hour saying, what do we mean by social enterprise? Ditto social investment. Some people call it CSR, some people call it social investment. When I was working at Shell, we never called it CSR, we called it sustainable development, which was more about the broader purpose of the company. When I was at Shell Foundation, we referred to this concept as enterprise-based philanthropy, which has now evolved into what people refer to as venture philanthropy. Sorry about the fly that's joined me here, but obviously she's interested in the debate. And when I look at now, for example, when we're talking in the center about, and we've had some interesting, healthy tension around this, when we talk about strategic philanthropy, what do we mean by strategic philanthropy? Shouldn't all philanthropy be strategic? Are we going to have centers for non-strategic philanthropy? I always used to get frustrated when I go to conferences and they say, let's talk about high impact philanthropy, as if one would actively promote low impact philanthropy. So I think it is a complexity, and I think it's something that that research centers can help contribute to, because part of the challenge is because we don't have academic disciplines specifically focusing on philanthropy, or indeed executive education that's in this space. We haven't institutionalized the narrative. And I think it's something we can learn from business schools. So when I was at Shell Foundation, for example, we would tend to hire into our team people from the corporation, because we believed that it was easier to teach business people about development than it was to teach development practitioners about some of the core challenges around going to scale and value creation. And that's a controversial topic in and of itself. You know, so do you take the lexicon of the business world and apply it to philanthropy, or does that somehow then undermine our commitment to social purpose and social impact? I know from my own experiences of talking to very diverse communities about venture philanthropy, of having had a huge backlash from when I talk about value creation, about more traditional philanthropists saying, how can you talk about value creation? You mean profit? And I say, no, I don't mean profit. I mean social value creation. So I think it is a huge challenge that we have in the sector of having a commonality of language that allows us to have conversations about the same thing, to compare apples with apples. But I think it's also the very nature of our sector and the nature of the evolution of this sector. I think it's something we need to keep very high on our radar screen and continue these discussions. But I think having centers like this, where you're going to have much more coherence around what you're talking about, and much more academic rigor in a way, and indeed like your own center, will help that conversation. And I think connecting more to the concepts in business around organizational efficiency will help. So I know when I was at Emirates Foundation, we underwent an excellence process, which is essentially, you know, the culmination of ISO process. And that, whilst we were somewhat skeptical about the value of it in the beginning, because it was all about bringing new terms around focus and process and capturing our outputs and measurement, etc., it created very interesting conversations, and it was essentially part of our institutionalization. So I think it is a complex area. I think it gets even more complex when you try and do it in Arabic, because there, you know, you start with social investment, and then is that CSR, or what does that mean? How do you say venture in Arabic? How do you say scalable in Arabic? I mean, so I think it's a very significant, it's right that we keep this challenge center and for, but I think that it's something that having more research and more executive education from a center like this, and indeed from your own, will help to develop and improve.
Okay. Now, another keyword that you've mentioned in the report is the concept of continuum. Now, if you think about it from a point of view of somebody who's starting with a venture, you'll find that initially actually he's going to spend from his own money. He's going to spend from family savings. He will use university grants. He will use government grants. He will use philanthropy. But then eventually, when he crosses the pioneer's gap, he will get into an area where he's going to actually appear more promising to your typical venture or typical commercial financier. So I think it's very non-conducive that, I mean, from a philanthropy point of view, yes, you want to slot yourself in a certain area, but from a research center, it's more actually conducive to look at it as a continuum, as you said, and to let people know that every stage in the development has a different types of finance requirements.
Yeah, well, I think that's why, you know, the language that we have seen in our sector is changing. So now we do increasingly, we talk about continuums, we talk about ecosystems, we talk about collaboration. And I think for me, I'm particularly interested in this area. So I think some of the most interesting things that are happening with philanthropic capital at this moment are where hybrid finance sits. So right down the other end is a continuum when you're looking at exactly a Ford Foundation looking at going into commercial capital markets. I think the really interesting, innovative stuff is happening there. But meanwhile, you've got some very smart grassroots organizations who best understand market needs. And I have found historically that there simply isn't enough glue along this, and indeed that's what prompted me writing the chapter for your book, was saying, how can we get the continuum to work more effectively together? I think in emerging markets, this is still less developed. When I go to events run by my former colleagues at Shell Foundation, they often have very unusual suspects in the room. They will have some, you know, really deep expertise in investment banking and private equity, coupled with social enterprises working with NGO communities on the ground in Africa. So I don't see that so much, particularly in the Middle East. And indeed, the chapter that I wrote for your book was based on an earlier article that I wrote for Philanthropy Impact in the UK, where they asked me to talk about the convergence, impact convergence in the Middle East. And I witnessed firsthand over the last 10, 20 years in the Middle East, the rise of angel investors, the rise of venture capital, private equity, the growing institutionalization of foundations, etc., and yet found that there was still a gap, that these actors weren't necessarily talking to each other, that angel investors were talking to angel investors, but angel investors weren't necessarily connected to foundations. For example, us at Emirates Foundation, we were essentially angel investing in social entrepreneurs by offering them seed capital. That conversation was not happening across the continuum, it was happening in isolation. When I was head of a small shout out to my friends at the Arab Foundations Forum, when I was chair of the Arab Foundations Forum, we indeed started this idea of, well, how do we bring specifically for job creation, how do we create a coalition so that we bring the ecosystem together? I think that's a huge missed opportunity in many emerging markets. And if we can look at more industrialized markets to help fast track that process, then I think that's a very good thing. So how do you make sure that the providers of capital understand that philanthropy and foundations are actually very close to the market? And if you're looking at something specifically like job creation, I mean, so many foundations in the Middle East are looking rightly at job creation. And yet how many of those foundations are directly working with the creators of capital? So when I was at Shell Foundation, we created a co-created social enterprise called Growfin, which is offering capital to SMEs. And I think that was a great example of how a foundation can ensure that there's an entity that's responding to specific market needs. But when you have the likes of Growfin working in emerging, how do you make sure that those organizations who have the capital are then connected to the foundations who are doing entrepreneurial training? So we know multiple foundations in the Middle East are looking at training young entrepreneurs. How do you make sure that when those young entrepreneurs graduate, they know how to source the capital? So I think there is a challenge around making the ecosystem more coherent and more consolidated. And I think the only way you can do that is working in collaboration, by using networks, and by getting more data. So if you know who's offering funding to startup entrepreneurs across a region, then it's much easier to direct that capital in the right place. But if we don't have the data, it's very difficult to do.
Yeah. Now, I have a question and then a comment, and then I'm going to pass it to Kariman. Now, Shell Foundation had something called enterprise philanthropy.
Yes.
Now, isn't that pretty much a venture philanthropy type? Or is it different than venture philanthropy?
Yes. So essentially, Shell Foundation invented that terminology before venture philanthropy kind of was really, I don't know when venture philanthropy was invented, but before it was used systematically. So it was like, if you like, just the forerunner term for venture philanthropy. But I think my colleagues at Shell Foundation are probably more likely now to use venture philanthropy interchangeably with enterprise-based philanthropy.
Okay, so it's really the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, my last question is about democratizing what we do. I mean, you do not want to create social entrepreneurs or top-bottom kind of a mindset who are elitist. You would want to sort of take this to the communities. You would want to make a little bit of a sense which is more of a bottom-up approach. And I want to get your feedback or your comments about this. How do we democratize what we are doing?
Look, I think, again, going back to the remit of our center, and, you know, it's taken me a while to realize that the importance of research, like if you are operating in a vacuum and you don't have real market data about what are the real needs, the grassroots community needs, then inevitably you can very easily get caught up in elitist structures that are not connected to your ultimate beneficiaries. And I think the easiest way to make sure that you don't do that is to keep going back and doing research, keep getting data, keep understanding the data. And now in the 21st century, in 2020, we have amazing opportunities to be able to capture that data, to process that data. We can use AI, we can use blockchain to much better understand. We can use predictive analytics to project future socioeconomic challenges. And I think that's something we haven't done systematically. Now, it may sound strange because on the one hand, you might argue that, you know, some of the growth of monopolistic nature of big tech and big data doesn't suggest that it can be more democratic. But I personally feel that the more data you have, the more it's open source, the more accessible that data is on what exactly are the socioeconomic problems that we're trying to solve, the more democratic you become because you're talking to those communities. I mean, democracy is ultimately about voice. And I think the problem is if you're doing philanthropy without data, without research, then you're probably going to come unstuck.
Thank you. Kariman, floor is yours, my dear.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Thank you so much, Claire. It's really impressive what you guys are trying to do at the center, and hopefully you can fill this gap. Okay.
Kariman, can you raise your voice, please? The volume is a little low.
Yeah, you can't hear me now?
I can hear you okay, Kariman. Yeah, it's not super loud, but it's good enough.
Okay, I will try to. Okay. Claire, could you please talk a bit about why do you think, if you think that philanthropists and the academic community, research centers, think tanks worldwide are doing enough to address the root causes of systemic injustice? Or are we just addressing the symptoms and maybe with good intentions, we are indirectly feeding a flawed system?
Well, I think that's the opportunity of a center like this, is that you may have rigorous academic studies, but how do we make sure that those academic studies translate into influencing practices on the ground, practitioners? And there's a lot of research that shows that whilst academic research may exist on multiple aspects of socioeconomic development, it's not necessarily accessible and it's not necessarily deployed by practitioners. So there's this real gap. In fact, one of our co-collaborators, Caroline Fines, who's working with us on the COVID-19 project, did some research on this and pointed out that it was UK specific research, but she researched what research is being done and how many charities actually use that, and what charities actually want. And she found that there was a dearth of academic research that was relevant to philanthropists. There was a dearth of accessibility, and often charities didn't know that this research existed, didn't know how to access it, and therefore weren't using it. And then there was a question about, well, actually, what do charities or foundations want in terms of research? And that's something we're very aware of. So at the center, we have a plan to start really with a mapping exercise. I mean, we're doing the COVID-19 research because obviously this crisis hit. But in parallel, we want to be looking at a really rigorous exercise of mapping what currently exists and what do philanthropists want in terms of data and research. So it's wonderful for academics to produce research, but if it's not then deployed and it's not adapted by practitioners, then it loses its potential. Our director at the Judge Business School, Christophe Loch, is very adamant about this, that we are an academic institution that wants to create impact. And we have the same mindset and philosophy at the center. We want to create impact. We want to be able to bridge academia with practitioners. And in a way, that is the very essence of our structure. So I'm not an academic, I'm a practitioner. And I've worked pretty much entirely in emerging markets. And my academic director, Kamal Munir, is an academic who has a very rich research and teaching portfolio around organizational efficiency and strategy and innovation. So I think the very nature of our team, the way we've constructed it, hopefully is already part of that solution. But we want to be a bridge between academia and practitioners. And, you know, whether that's social justice or border socioeconomic issues, I think the only way you can do that is by connecting these communities and making sure that we don't work in isolation.
Thank you. Another question, what is your center's approach to the fact that different geographies are inspired by different moral philosophies that do not necessarily reflect market relations?
I'm not quite sure what they meant by reflect market relations, but if I talk more broadly, so clearly, I mean, my whole career has pretty much been in development and in emerging markets. Clearly, there is massive heterogeneity across emerging markets. Clearly, Africa is very different from the Middle East, which is very different from Southeast Asia. However, if you look at development theory, it's essentially about institutional development. You know, how do you create effective institutions, be they political, social, or economic, or other? And I have found in my own experience of working with foundations in Africa and in the Middle East that there is, however, a commonality around some of the challenges that philanthropists face in these markets. And even when I was at Shell Foundation, we like to be pretty sector agnostic. This is not about the what you're doing in philanthropy. So are you doing human rights, you're doing education, you're doing job creation, you're doing poverty alleviation. It's not so much about that, it's about the how. So if you can adopt a model that is effective because it's more focused, you're able to measure your outcomes, you're taking long-term perspectives, you're listening to your grantees, you're working in collaboration with partners, you're looking at a variety of financial instruments. Those kind of, some of those pointers around how we can render organizations more efficient and more effective, I think are geography agnostic, and they're also sector agnostic. So if you want a foundation to deliver maximum output, of course, you want effective internal systems and process and strategy. Now that is going to remain the same, whether I'm a foundation dealing with human rights in Kenya, or a foundation in Malaysia looking at access to healthcare, or a foundation in Saudi Arabia that's promoting female labor force participation. Irrespective of your sector, your internal structure and efficiency can be developed and be super rigorous, and you can share. And indeed, we have seen that with the Arab Foundations Forum, where we've shared across the region ideas around impact and effectiveness, irrespective. And I think often as practitioners, we get a bit hung up on, oh, you're doing human rights, oh, you're doing job creation, oh, you're doing poverty alleviation. And then for some reason, we think we can't talk to each other. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think we can have collective conversations which start with, irrespective of what particular SDG you're addressing, how do you raise funds? How do you deploy your brand more effectively? How do you build the competencies of your team? How do you make sure your back office systems are effective? How do you make sure that you're really delivering impact and you can measure it, and that that's not a hugely burdensome process? How do you make sure that when you engage with your funders, you're offering them a value add, but they're not then undermining your mission? I mean, there are all these conversations around how you operate effectively as a foundation, or even an NGO, or even a social enterprise, I don't think should be held hostage by the specific sectoral issue that you're dealing with.
Thank you. Right, talking about the value of data, there are current discussions going around potentials of blockchains to boost the effectiveness of philanthropy through promoting transparency, accountability, and proof of impact. Question is, in our regional context, do you think that the use of blockchains in philanthropy is desirable, feasible, and viable? Are we ready for that? Should we be ready for that?
Okay, so I'm not going to pretend that I'm a tech expert by any means. You know, I kind of struggle with Zoom calls. However, I do like to stay abreast of the advent of new technology and its impact. And I personally think there are multiple reasons why the Middle East can not only adopt, deploy, and use, let's call it big data for now, more effectively. One is the fact that you have young people, right? So you have more digital natives than pretty much any other region. I mean, the percentage of youth in the Middle East is higher as a percentage of the total population than I think any other region, even Africa. So first of all, you have a lot of smart young things in the Arab world. So young people, digital natives, are intrinsically born into this space. I was having a conversation a few days ago with some colleagues of mine at the university, actually, about how we, how organizations are having to transition into a digital modus operandi, partly because of COVID and partly because they were anyway. And I was saying, isn't it interesting that for certain generations, it's a transition. If you're 20, 30 years old, it's not a transition. You were born into that space. You intrinsically know how to use data. I think when you add to that the philosophy of open data, there's a huge movement now with the Creative Commons and open data, a movement that seeks to ensure that we can build iteratively, that data is not proprietary. And I think that's something that you're already seeing in the Middle East. There are examples of it, young, smart pioneers in the region that are advocating for open data. And then, so you add whatever platform that may be, or whatever tool, if it's AI or Bitcoin or blockchain. To me, it's about the philosophy. So first of all, embracing digital. I think we're at the beginning of a digital revolution, and I don't think we're going to go back. Some might argue that sometimes we need to get off the grid and go a bit analog, but I think that is an evolution. So if you take that plus the huge need for data in the Middle East and the fact that these technologies are able to capture it, unstructured data now, whatever's out there in cyberspace, you can capture that. So this is a fundamental, a massive shift. When I was working as a journalist in the Middle East in the 90s, my biggest challenge was getting access to data. It was extremely difficult. And even if you could get access, it was difficult to ensure that it was accurate. That is going to shift, whether we like it or not, because of the advent of big tech and global platforms and big data, unstructured data. Now, whether the Middle East will choose to deploy blockchain to get better at doing philanthropy, I think will be an outcome of how quickly we can build competences in the sector and professionalize the sector. But I think the Middle East is well positioned to do so because of this youthful population, which means you've got a lot more digital natives than other parts of the world who intrinsically understand this. And you also have, this has been questioned as to whether this is an urban myth or not. But I feel that the new generations have a more fundamental intrinsic sense of social purpose. So I think when you put those two things together, and I've seen it myself, we see how many young Arabs are looking to create solutions themselves, looking to establish social enterprises, and those people already have digital skills. So therefore, I think that bodes extremely well for the sector, philanthropists, to leverage those two trends and ensure that we do adopt technology where possible, but not just for the sake of it, for the sake of democratizing, for the sake of better understanding. I mean, ultimately, let's face it, that's the good bit about data. We get a bit scared now when we hear about big data and whatever, the GAFA are doing. But the reality is that data should, in principle, make us better informed, give voice to those people that we're trying to help, and ultimately help us create solutions, philanthropic programs that are better positioned to solve problems. And that's what we want, right? Problem solving. And I think historically, we simply haven't had that data. And hence some of our solutions haven't been as effective as they should have, because we simply didn't have enough knowledge about the problem we were trying to solve.
Thank you, Claire. Claire, from your experience, if you can talk a bit about the healthy degree of donors' engagement in the research they fund, or the institutions they support? Do you have examples of successful practices that you can share with us?
I think that's a growth. I think historically donors, and again, we say donors, what do we mean by donors? Do we mean foundations? Do we mean bilateral aid organizations? Do we mean private individuals? So this is, you know, one has to be careful about big generalizations. But I think the desire to fund research historically has not been there so much in our sector. Again, it's been this kind of like, we recognize a socioeconomic challenge. They're often wicked problems. We know that they're entrenched. We want to jump in and provide a program and provide solutions, which is perfectly understandable and well-intentioned. But I think it makes much more sense. And I've done that myself, by the way, with programs, jumped in, said, let's get this thing running. And then like, aha, actually, we didn't understand enough what the problem was. So I think there is an opportunity for donors absolutely to fund more research, and for foundations to say, you know, so both for grantees and grant makers to have a conversation. So where traditionally a grant maker might have said, no, this has to be purely for your programs, grantees should say, well, actually our programs are not going to be effective if we don't have research. So I think there needs to be much more conversation. I think grantees should be much more vocal about the need for research. I think it can make a huge difference. And by the way, research doesn't have to be some kind of necessarily some kind of long-term academic exercise, or even, you know, sometimes people talk about RCTs, but they're too expensive. Research can be simply engagement. So when, for example, at Emirates Foundation, we decided to create a program for financial literacy for young people, because we recognized there was a problem around personal finance in our market, and that young people were getting overly indebted for all the wrong reasons. And we decided to do some research before we created the actual program. We knew we wanted to create the program, but we decided not to create it before we'd done the research. That research was going out to the market. So we went and we spoke to the banks, we spoke to the central bank, we spoke to the electronic payment cards, to MasterCard, to Visa. We spoke to the marriage fund, because the marriage fund said, you know, this is a challenge for us as well. People are getting indebted because they're taking loans to get married. We spoke to schools, we spoke to the Ministry of Education. We wanted to make sure that before we launched the program, we understood what the problem was, and we understood what everybody else was already doing, because clearly there's no point in creating a program in a vacuum, and let's build on what others are doing. So we did 1 year of research, if you want to call it that, but it was workshops, it was engagement. It wasn't so much about data collection, specific data collection, because that was a challenge. But then once we created the program, but then that became, you know, then we ended up then creating a youth index, which was a regular process of going out into the market and getting data. So I think, yes, research. If you ask me what was one of my greatest regrets in my career, I would say not having had research high enough up on my agenda from an early stage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Claire. I'll ask you two interrelated questions, actually. You talked already about why do you think business schools is the proper fit to host centers and offer degrees in philanthropy. Can you give us an idea about what should be changed inside the business schools so that they could offer even more conducive environment for philanthropy centers to operate? The other question is, do you think that there is a gap between business schools and other social science and humanities schools inside universities worldwide? What could the centers like yours and ours do to bridge this gap?
So I'm new to academia in the sense that this is the first time I work, you know, inside a university. So I'm kind of exploring this question myself already. But I think already, I think both parties have a lot to learn from the other. So I think the fact that there aren't a huge amount of philanthropy centers, research centers inside universities, means clearly there's a lot to learn for business schools to learn about philanthropy. But how is a business school going to learn about philanthropy if we don't have the data, we don't have the research on philanthropy? So it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario. But I think what I am witnessing firsthand is, for example, inside the Judge Business School, there's a huge appetite to get that information, to get that research on philanthropy, to understand philanthropy better, and to see how the business school can support in maximizing that impact. I think this convergence that we talked about earlier is happening inevitably. So where commercial organizations, businesses are looking at how they too can create social value, there is an inevitable growth in interest, a growth in mutuality, growth in wanting to come together to understand better. So I personally, I love the fact that our center is inside the business school. I wouldn't want it anywhere else. because I think that is a future opportunity. You know, the day will come perhaps when organizations are so effectively managing, when businesses are so effectively managing their negative externalities that you won't need philanthropy. It will be fundamentally encapsulated in the way organizations operate. And that convergence, again, a word we've used a lot in this conversation, is already happening. So what better place to be to leverage that and to run with that than inside a business school? So I think we're in exactly the right place at the right time, moreover.
Claire, what is, from your own point of view, what is the relationship of politics, current Middle East governments to philanthropy, and how will you take this into consideration?
Yeah, the two topics you're never supposed to discuss, right? Politics and religion is the one about. Politics in the Middle East, my favorite subject. And when I was at university, I was all over that, trust me, I was all over that. And then I ended up working more in philanthropy and less focused on politics. But I think for me, politics in the Middle East, it's about policy. And I think, siasa, interesting, we're having a conversation about how in English, you can distinguish between policy and politics, and in French and Arabic, you can't. It's kind of, it all rolls into one linguistically. But it's about policy. And I have seen in the Middle East for the last 20 years, governments are trying to do the right thing. They're starting to understand philanthropy, the opportunity of philanthropy. How can we get more of this philanthropy? How can we make sure it's better, it's more impactful? And I think that is a well-intentioned goal. And I think governments are realizing that this is an important source of capital. It can help them with the advent of the SDGs, to deliver on the SDGs. But I think there needs to be more understanding from governments in the region about what we actually mean by philanthropy. What is a social enterprise? What is social investment? What is CSR? And I think one of the challenges has been we've been seeing governments respond overly quickly, almost a knee-jerk response to curtailing some of these flows due to fear of not really understanding where the money is coming from, who it's going to, and what is the ultimate goal. And I think that is unfortunate. And I think that is something that we certainly might be looking at our center, like how can we help governments in the region to understand the opportunity of philanthropy and help to create a conducive environment to ensure that it is deployed effectively for real socioeconomic impact.
Thank you. Final question. It is, okay. Do you find the word philanthropy limiting? And why linguistically it is defined as the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the generous donation of money to good causes. Why is it now a problem sometimes to use the word philanthropy?
Wow, that's a big one, and that needs definitely another webinar. If you look at what happened at Davos, if you look at the whole discourse around taxation versus philanthropy, billionaire philanthropists, I think there's a huge complexity around what we mean by philanthropy. Is it good, bad, ugly? But I think if you personally, you know, in order to not go into that rabbit hole on this call, because we only have 2 minutes left, although I think it is important. So I personally feel comfortable using the word philanthropy. Sometimes it worries me that people still perceive it as something kind of old school and bureaucratic, when I think there are some very interesting and innovative things happening in our sector. So I think we need to get better at showcasing those. But I think ultimately, if you come down to it, going back to my linguistic roots, philanthropy is phili, I think, anthropos. It's Greek for love of humans. So I think we should stop trying to define it in broader spectrums and just say, this is about, you know, this is about supporting humanity. It's about creating a public good. It's about creating positive systemic solutions to some of the world's most pressing challenges. And it is about the love of humans. And I think, yes, there are multiple derivatives thereof, but it is fundamentally a good thing. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. Doesn't mean we can't criticize it or challenge it, but it's fundamentally a good thing. And if we had more effective, sustainable, scalable, high impact philanthropy, I genuinely believe the world would be a better place.
Thank you so much, Claire. I enjoyed this discussion big time. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all of you. شكرا لكم كلكم. فرصة سعيدة على الكل.
Claire, thank you. Thanks a lot. It's been very enlightening. on next Tuesday, July 7th at 1 o'clock Cairo time, we will have Robert Key. Robert Key, the title of his webinar is The Virus of Poverty is Fraud. Robert Key has founded a foundation called the Operation Hope, which is a Singaporean NGO based in Singapore, and it's operating in Cambodia and Nepal since 2002. They run programs in community, skills training, volunteer, and children, and he's gonna give us like real field experience of how to curtail or to sort of control fraud. Should be very interesting. He's a very interesting person with very nice experiences in Cambodia and Nepal. So stay tuned. We'll see you soon, inshallah. And thank you, Claire, again for the participation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye.